Ewert. Hi, John.
Hey, guys. Hey, Marta or Rick, are you guys there?
Yeah,
Hey, can you shoot me the agenda again? For some reason, it's not popping up in my email.
yep. Marta's going to get that over to you, John.
Okay, thanks.
And if we get a quorum before I'm back, I need to run out to my vehicle and grab my glasses. So you can get started without me.
Okay. Hey, Marta, you're sending me a agenda, right?
Sorry, my computer's being a little slow, but I shot it over to you. So let me know. if you-
Okay, thank you. I don't know why I can't find my last one. I have July. There we go. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, John, it looks like you have well, I'm trying to remember how many is a quorum now. I know you've got 4 of you here.
Yeah, I think that is a quorum. Do we have Trevor on yet? I can't see Trevor.
I'm here, John. Can you hear me?
Oh, Trevor is. Okay. Hi, Trevor.
Hi.
Yes, I can. Okay. How about Ron Lackey?
I don't see Ron on either.
Okay. Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be starting the, welcome everybody to the August 3rd, 2021 Ogden Valley Planning Commission. Let's go ahead and start off with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, I appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and do a roll call. It looks like right now we have myself, Commissioner Lewis, Commissioner Howell, Commissioner Torman, Commissioner Francis, and Commissioner Schuman in attendance. Absent so far is Commissioner Burton and Commissioner Lackey. First of all, has everyone had a chance to review the minutes from June 8th? And does anybody have any things to correct or change about them?
Thought they looked fine to me.
I'm sorry?
They looked fine to me.
Oh, okay. Okay, hearing no objections, I'll go ahead and vote them in, or whatever we're doing now. Enter them into the public record. Okay, before we adjourn to the work session, I'll go ahead and open it up for public comment for items that are not on the agenda. What is on the agenda for later is the Eden area plan. But is there anything anybody would like to say regarding anything else that's not on the agenda? Marta, if you could take a look at the responses on web, and Rick, if you're in the conference room, if there's anybody in the conference room, Rick?
No, nope.
Okay,
And John, this is Steve. I'll be hosting tonight's meeting instead of Marta, and I don't see anybody raising hands or commenting right now. So
right, okay. Okay, any further comments from planning commissioners? Any comments from the planning director, Rick?
Nope. No, thank you.
Okay. Anything from legal?
No, it was fine. Thank you.
Woo. Your mic is killing me. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and adjourn to the work session. Thank you all for coming. All right, welcome to the work session. So work session item number 1, discussion on the Eden area plans. I believe Steve, Burton, and Charlie are going to be presenting on this one.
Hey, John, yes, we will be. I just wanted to comment right after you close the public comment, someone raised their hand, but if you'd like, we can wait if you want, or I don't know if you want to give that person a chance.
No, let's go ahead and reopen the public portion of the first meeting. Is there somebody who has something they want to throw in there?
Yep, it looks like somebody named Deb raised their hand. Deb, if you can hear us, you can unmute and speak.
Okay, I have a question and I don't know for sure what's on the agenda, but I was wondering what the Valley plan is for B&Bs.
Okay. Well, in particular, the plan, I guess you'd have to check with Steve and the planning department regarding specific questions. If you have some comments you'd like to bring up, we'll be glad to hear them.
Well, it seems like there's an awful lot of B&Bs up here. And I'm just wondering if you have any intentions of putting some restrictions on.
Yeah, Deb, as Mr. Lewis mentioned, this particular setting is more of along the lines of comments for the planning commissioners, not necessarily questions. But what I'll do is I'm happy to just message you here on Zoom and give you my number, and I can talk to you a little bit more about that at maybe tomorrow or later this week, if that's okay.
That's fine.
Thanks.
Good question, though. There's lots to talk about regarding that. So Steve would be a good resource to start with. Okay, anything else for the public? Okay, I'll go ahead and close the public portion. And again, we'll go to the work session. So Steve or Charlie, do you guys want to go ahead and take it?
Yes, I think Charlie was going to start out.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Can you hear me okay?
Barely.
How about now?
Yeah, too close. Back up.
Hang on a second. Let me close my door. Had a little bit of, I think, background office noise, but thank you, Mr. Chairman and planning commissioners. I'm going to share my screen with you here. Steve and I are going to be presenting. Oh, Steve, can you enable screen sharing?
Yep, just 1 second here. Okay, you're good to go.
So, hang on, let me get my screen positioned correctly. Can you see my cursor?
Yep.
Perfect. First thing I wanted to do is just kind of make sure we just kind of set the tone for the meeting and kind of have a basic understanding of the zoning for the area. I know we got a couple of new planning commissioners on, and I want to make sure we looked at how the different colors on a map, what they represent, and how they are currently versus how they might be in the future. So we're looking in the Eden area. Steve and I, we started really focusing on the Old Town Eden area a while back, but it became clear as we were looking at this that the link between the Old Town Eden area and the four-way intersection in Eden was really important. We were reviewing what the students at Utah State University provided for us a couple of years back, and showing the linkages between the two did seem fairly important. One of the big concerns that I think the public had about what the students had prepared was density in that particular area and how density is going to be treated going into the future. And so we wanted to take a really good close look at that, and kind of come up with an idea of what we're calling it kind of a 30-year plan, but really that the number is flexible. It kind of depends on development trends. It depends on landowners' willingness to whether or not they want to develop now or in the future. We're not trying to encourage development, but we are trying to help shape that development as landowners do choose to develop. We know that we have a directive in the Ogden Valley General Plan that whatever we do, we want to limit the amount of density to existing land rights. Now, the existing rights for the area on the valley floor could produce a potential build out of between 14 and 15,000 dwelling units, and that's just on the valley floor. Right now we've got, well, we don't have the 2020 census data just yet. We'll have that in a few months, but there's an estimate of right around between 4,000 and 5,000 dwelling units in the Ogden Valley. And so we're talking about the potential of another 10,000 dwelling units. So 2/3 growth on the valley floor with existing rights. So when we were looking at the Ogden Valley General Plan in 2016, what we heard overwhelmingly from the public was, if that's what the number of rights are allocated right now, don't let it be anything more than that. At least not until we get closer to that build out. And we think that's a good idea. Stick with the amount of rights that are allocated. But the question about where the allocation is and where those rights should be located became kind of a sore spot for a lot of people. For most people, it was not in my neighborhood. That was the answer I think we got for most people. But as we're looking across the valley floor, we certainly need to identify where good growth should occur, because if we don't do that, the existing allocation is one dwelling unit every 3 acres spread out across the valley floor. That might be ideal. That might be an ideal outcome for some people in the desire for elbow room and desire to have a little bit more open space for their own personal uses. But if you look at one dwelling unit every 3 acres across the valley floor, what you're really doing is swallowing up all the land, consuming it for residential area, even though it is 3 acres per lot, and essentially eliminating some of the wide open areas that you currently have that currently creates the character of that area. And so what came out from that plan was the idea that we should be focusing a lot of this development in village areas, village nodes, if you will. And we've got a handful of village nodes, but Old Town Eden and the kind of the four-way intersection or New Town Eden here have been identified as two different villages where growth should occur. What that means is, if we're going to allow growth to occur here, but no new density, we need to look at these open lands where there's not a lot of growth now and encourage or incentivize those landowners to sell their rights, not their land, but the right to develop to people, to developers who would like to develop in these more centralized locations. So you might get an increased amount of dwelling units and commercial activity in in these major village they're small village areas here, and that's the offset to ensure that a lot of these open undeveloped lands remain so. Now there's a few different methods that we can get to this outcome. One is a really heavy-handed method where we create a map that looks at all of the open lands in these areas and say, all right, landowners of open lands, you can't build, but you could sell all of your development rights. So you could still get your financial value out of it and you keep your land. but you can't build. That's really heavy-handed. But what it does is it incentivizes by essentially a mandate for that landowner to sell their development rights to someone who wants to build in one of these smaller village areas. That's like I said, really heavy-handed. Really light-handed would be to go to all these landowners out here and say, hey, you're in an area where we would like to see your development rights moved from here to some of these village areas. And Wolf Creek is one, Nordic is one, Liberty is one. You've got the eastern edge of Huntsville town, and you've got this intersection here, as well as a little bit over in here, that are all slated for these kind of small mixed-use villages. So that's the lighter-handed method of doing it, is saying it's completely optional. Landowner, if you want to keep it open, you could sell your land, put a conservation easement, or excuse me, sell your rights, put a conservation easement on the land, and continue to use and operate the land as you have been for the last who knows how long. And then there's the middle ground right between the two, where you say, all right, maybe you can get 50% of the amount of density you could have otherwise gotten. So if you've got 100 acres, maybe you can get, you could have gotten 30 homes out of that. Maybe you can get 15, and the other 15 you need to reserve for selling to a developer who's going to be moving into one of these locations. And so those 15 would then move over to here, and the other 15 would be built on the property, or some combination. Maybe somebody has the right to build 30 and they only want to build 29 and sell one of them. My gut feel is that that middle ground, somewhere between the light-handed and the middle-handed, is where the county commission is going to fall. We do know that we've got a water study that says that if we keep putting septic systems in this area here and these areas in here, we will be contributing to poor groundwater quality going forward in the future. In fact, that study recommended that we look at actually requiring a minimum lot size going from one unit on 3 acres to 1 unit on 6 acres. And so maybe a middle ground is to do exactly that middle piece, where we say, all right, 50% of your density or your density rights can be built here. The rest of it you need to sell to a developer who wants to build in one of these village areas. Okay, so that's kind of how the private market could work, how the county could affect or influence the private market, and how we might see additional or increased density in these areas without causing increased density across the valley floor in totality. We are working on a method. They're called transferable development rights. We're working on a mechanism to make that happen. We've actually, through the accessory dwelling unit ordinance that was passed last December, we have a very light version of transferable development rights. If we've got time at the end of this work session, I've got some questions for the planning commissioners to kind of help shape where those transferable rights should be moved from and moved to. And I'll show you kind of the framework of the concept TDR ordinance, which we'll be working through over the next few work sessions as well. And that's after Steve kind of goes over the village ordinance. So in today's meeting, we'll look at the 30-year build out for this intersection here, where really it's this land area right in here that I'm circling here. We'll look at the 30-year build out. We want to talk a little bit about phasing, like how quickly or how slowly do we want to see that build out come to fruition, and in what order. And then as we look at all of that and the different maps that I've kind of developed with that outcome in mind, Steve will then go over the framework of the ordinance that we've been working on. So basically, we're creating a brand new zone. It's going to be called the village zone. It's going to be applicable in these village areas, and we can adopt the zone and go ahead and apply it to certain properties. We can choose which properties it should be applied to. We can adopt the zone and not apply it to any property and wait for landowners to come and ask for it. We could do a combination of the two. It really comes down to, again, that order of operation and how the Planning Commission would like to see that recommended to the County Commission. Our goal is by the end of this year that we'll have a village zone adopted that will have some component of transferable development rights, where the village areas will be receiving development rights coming from other areas on the valley floor. That will govern some the overarching architectural style. We don't want to get into designing buildings for people, but we would like to start identifying the overarching principles of the architecture of these areas. And then talking about the public land, for example, the parks, the trails, recreational areas, open space areas. If in each of these areas, we should be talking about where parking can be located, at least on a community scale, community parking for these villages, park and rides for the ski resorts, that sort of thing. Okay. Any questions before I move over to the maps? Okay. So actually, let's start with a different map here. Let's look. Let's see here. And sorry, this is a very big program, and my computer is mostly up to par to run it. Takes a little bit. So this map here generally shows the existing conditions with buildings that are in this Eden area. Now, I haven't put a polygon around what defines Eden. I think that's something we're going to want to do as part of this plan. But I have kind of identified where Wolf Creek area and Nordic area, Nordic Valley area plans are. And really just kind of a gut check for the Planning Commission. The Wolf Creek area, I looked at property boundaries in the area and boundaries that are directly related to the Wolf Creek area. That's how I came up with this boundary. Nordic area, I just essentially took the ridge line of the drainage and said this hillside, which faces Eden, is the Eden hillside, and the back side or the hillside back here is the Nordic hillside. And back here, this is where the Nordic subdivision is as it comes down, and you can see this road that pipes up into the Nordic area. Any questions on these boundaries or how they're laid out or concerns? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, it looks like we've got a question from a member of the public.
Yeah, I'm not aware that we're opening this up to the public, are we, Charlie?
Really up to you as the chair. We were hoping to kind of present this to the Planning Commission. We will have public hearings where we'll have public comment periods, but if we've got clarity that's desired or needed, I'm more than happy to answer any question.
Yeah, well, for right now, we'd like to hear your presentation and tell us what all you're thinking here. Let's just get it on top of the table first.
And Deb, when you get in touch, or when Steve gets in touch with you, we can go over each of these and answer some of the questions that you might have as well. It's really good to hear from members of the public who live in these areas as well, because we can help incorporate a lot of those comments into this as we move forward.
Yeah, that would be great.
Awesome. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. One of the things to make sure that everyone knows, we did start with a committee of landowners and business owners in this area here as we started developing this plan. And then it just kind of grew on us. We weren't really quite ready to move over into this area here, but we had some direction from the commission to do so, because development is occurring. And if we don't have a good plan in place, developers are going to do whatever they want to do. Whatever makes most sense for them, and sometimes what makes most sense for them excludes opportunities for having community cohesion. Okay, so just getting a general understanding idea of how the buildings are currently laid out. Now, if we go into the future and we're looking at a 30-year plan, and I want to make sure it's very clear that we're talking about 30 years, you could have something that looks like that. Again, the idea being that all the new density you see in these areas would be collected from other areas on the valley floor across the valley that are not being developed as a result of them being moved into this area. And as you look at each of these buildings, you can kind of see how this works. You've got, these are all, generally speaking, 3-acre lots. So this can all be developed. This here, this up in here, these guys out in here, these can all be developed at 1 unit per 3 acres under our existing zoning. So wouldn't even need to transfer those units in here. As you get closer to the Eden Park, you can see you get a little bit closer together. This is about 1 unit to the acre. In fact, you currently have some, this is up in here, this development here, these are all 1 acre lots. So you can see this is all 1 unit to the acre. This is the same density in this neighborhood here as the town of Huntsville. So if you were to drive through the town of Huntsville, that's what you would see here, and kind of in the proximity on the outside of town over in these locations here. As you get closer to the park, your density would increase. You'd be looking at 1/2 acre and then 1/4 acre, and then internal here we could see, let's get in there a little closer, a little bit bigger buildings. You would have a combination of multifamily housing and commercial buildings with residential above. One thing that I'm not super clear on whether or not the general public understands is you're not going to get commercial street facades in these village locations unless you have housing within a walkable proximity. It's just, in a community like this, you're just not going to get those commercial opportunities, generally speaking, without people who live there who can shop at those commercial facilities at the stores on the shoulder season. A lot of this village, I think, would be quite dependent on the ski season and on the recreation season in the summertime, both recreation summer and winter. But when you get to the shoulder season, that's what really defines whether or not a business can survive in a community. And that does require people who live in close proximity to it. The higher density housing that you might see in here, so the higher density would be internal block, kind of surrounded by commercial retail operations with 2nd story office space or 2nd story residential space. The vast majority of this area, we're only suggesting up to 2 stories. We're not suggesting any higher than 2 stories. So as you're looking at these buildings, we're not talking about skyscrapers by any means. We're talking about 2-story buildings. This intersection right here, there may be an opportunity for 3-story buildings on a very limited scale, but we're not, we wouldn't be talking about anything more than that. And 3-story is obviously, that's up for conversation. Everything else on the periphery would be no more than 35 feet, as is currently allowed by our current development codes. Over here at the 4-way intersection, this would be a little bit more, you'd still have some street-oriented residential on these side streets here. This street here is one that exists. It ends right about here. That one is Valley Junction Drive. It's just a matter of time before it connects over to the highway here. This corner right here is actually currently being held by Golden West Credit Union that was just built last year. There'd be, in this general location, there'd be more car-oriented commercial opportunities. So, for example, this building right here, this is the existing shape and size of the Valley Market. That is the size of a medium-sized grocery store here. I can't remember how many square feet this is. Our general plan talks about capping square footage of buildings to 30,000 square feet if it's like commercial opportunities. So we're not looking at big box, Walmart-sized buildings. This building is about double the size of the existing grocery store. And the land that's actually owned right over in this location is land that's currently owned by the same landowner who owns the grocery store, with the possible opportunity for the future of moving the grocery store to this location here. These other little buildings here, you see them all over the place, kind of more strip commercial. We're not trying to drag this commercial down the highways. We're trying to keep it kind of centrally located in this area. But these small buildings, you might see a drive-through restaurant or a bank with a drive-through, so automobile oriented. And then along these streets here in the center, this is where you'd find your walkable oriented commercial, where people would come, they would find a parking lot in an interior block, and they would then walk through an alleyway or down the street into the storefronts of these buildings. So today, we govern development regulations through, it's called Euclidean zoning. Euclidean zoning is basically, let's see, it's where we adopt polygons, and we say anything inside this polygon, here's the list of uses, and here's how big your lot size can be. It's a little more complicated than that, but that is generally speaking how it works. When we're looking at a village area, we're not as concerned about the uses. I mean, we don't want a gravel pit. I think we've made that very clear in these locations, but we want to be a lot more concerned about the public realm. And the public realm is going to be, it's your streetscape and it's your building facades. What happens inside of those buildings is secondary. If you can get your streetscape built to an inviting streetscape that's inviting to people, get them out of their cars, get them out in front of those storefronts where they could see the wares that are for sale, you are going to have a much better degree of success in the longevity of your village. If you focus on the use, you're not putting enough emphasis on the form. And so we're talking about possibly moving away from Euclidean type, let's just adopt a polygon and say these are the uses that are allowed here, and moving into design oriented or a form oriented type of ordinance, which planners call form-based zoning or form-based code. Basically, in a form-based code, instead of looking at these polygons and saying these are the uses, we're going to look at the street and say, along this street, we want to see buildings that look like this. Maybe it's street-oriented commercial with residential above. Maybe it's office space set back a little bit. Maybe it's all residential. But we're looking at what kind of buildings are located adjacent to that street and how that looks from the street area. That does a couple of things. That allows the landowner a lot more flexibility on how they can use their land. Now, it does put some regulations on the visual aesthetics of the buildings that go on the land, but the use of those buildings are a lot less heavily regulated. Now, there are some things like, for example, we'll still have a use table for these village zones. Some things we still may want to call out separately. For example, a bar or a nightclub. Let's just use that as an example. Those can get loud. Do you want a bar or a nightclub in a specific area? I mean, we already know that the DABC says it can't be within a certain proximity of a school or a church. And so, we've got to have certain proximity regulations. But you may want to say certain types of uses, just they don't belong in certain areas, and that's fine. But when we get down to the granular level to say a candy store can be located here, but a confectionery cannot be located here, we're getting really granular, and it gets really challenging because the private market does whatever the private market does, and it's hard for us to get down into the weeds to say that a confectionery store and a candy store are two separate things. And so it's better for us to just say, is it food oriented? Is it entertainment oriented? Is it retail oriented? And just group things generally together instead of having a very, very detailed use list like we currently do under these polygons here. Any questions about that idea?
Nope.
Okay. So I wanted to show you these polygons here. CV2 is the more community-oriented commercial. So so we've got neighborhood-oriented commercial, we've got community-oriented commercial, and we have regional-oriented commercial. Up in the valley, we're probably not going to have a lot of regional-oriented commercial. That's the kind of stuff you see out in the commercial corridors of Ogden. But we do want to see community-oriented, and I think at least in this neighborhood here, we'll see a lot of community draw. This neighborhood here will have a little bit of community, but I think it'll be mostly neighborhood-oriented. We're obviously going to have resort-oriented development in both locations, and that's kind of a different animal by itself. But if we focus on neighborhood and community, I think we're going to be, we'll be able to work in resort-oriented. Okay, I wanted to show you the polygons because I do have a map that shows polygons like Euclidean zoning. And then I've got a map that shows the streets from a street regulating plan, kind of like I was talking. I just want to make sure it's clear how we might move from Euclidean zoning into something that's a lot more like form-based zoning. So this is the park, right? Just make sure we're all oriented. Most of this corner here is already Commercial Valley 2. This line here is Commercial Valley 2. It's not hard to see how this corner here, just going all the way over along the street frontage, could easily become that Commercial Valley 2 to create that commercial streetscape. And then maybe at some point in the future, so really we're just talking about these properties and this 1 or 2 or 3 here, and you've already got that side and that side of the park commercial in nature. I think the most logical next step would either be looking at this side here or something a little bit further in this direction, down to about this location here for commercial. But I wouldn't look at much more commercial than this street, this street, this street, and maybe a little bit as you're around this bend here. And that would be at a 30-year build out. So we're not talking about a huge amount of commercial. So when we look at this, we're not talking about a huge amount of commercial, even though we're all looking at more buildings. So let's look at this from a Euclidean perspective. So the lighter red polygons, if we were to enforce or implement these kinds of plans from the Euclidean perspective, or how we currently do our zoning, we would essentially take all this land here and say, all right, this is our mixed use commercial space. Interior and right on the periphery is our multifamily housing. As you move out, you're going to have a little bit smaller lot sizes, but single family residential, half acre lot sizes, half acre to an acre, and then 1 acre to 3 acres out on the periphery here. And then as you move into these locations here, we're talking about 3 acres plus in the darker green. Over here in Old Town Eden area, this would be your vehicle-oriented commercial, kind of this magenta. The red would be mixed use, street-oriented commercial. Yellow or orange, excuse me, the orange would be the multifamily. And this is already zone manufacturing, industrial, so probably just keep it as it is, but it's very light manufacturing, very light industrial. And then maybe something over in this area that's a little bit more community or government related. So public lands, maybe you've got a park and ride facility, a multi-model transit station. Maybe that's where a large parking lot is for people to come who are going to the ski resorts. They come, they park their car here, they jump on a ski bus and they go up to the resort, so that we're not clogging up all of the roads that go up to Nordic or Powder Mountain. One of the benefits of having a parking structure or parking lot out in these areas would be that somebody's dropping their car off and then they're going through the commercial area to get to their next destination. They're going to see storefronts that they're going to be interested in going into, or they're going to see eateries that they're going to be interested in going into. And then they're going to come off the mountain, whether it's mountain biking or skiing or whatever it is they're choosing to do for recreation, come off the mountain, be dropped off in the location of their car, and they're going to want to walk to that location. I mean, they could get in their car and drive over to it, but if we create a community where it's inviting to walk, even in ski season, you go to somewhere like Park City, and I don't want to say this is going to be Park City because it's not. It is not going to be as urbanized as Park City is. More park, less city is what I keep hearing people say. Even in those areas, on good ski days, on good snow days, you still have people who are frequenting the eateries and the pubs and stuff like that in the downtown area. And it captures a really good economic base that then can be reinvested into the community. Obviously, in order to do this, we're going to need to have sewer. But we're working on different ideas for sewer for this area, even as we speak. And so hopefully we can get sewer resolved. There are funding mechanisms that can be put in place to help build infrastructure ahead of development. So as that infrastructure gets there, it's easier to implement a plan like this. But without a plan like this, if you go ahead and throw infrastructure in, all of a sudden you've eliminated a barrier to growth, and everyone who owns land in the area is going to want to do what they feel like is best. And so it's better to put a plan in place on the front end so the landowners kind of know what direction to go as they're looking at developing their land, as opposed to, you know, every man for himself sort of development mentality. The dashed lines represent possible streets and potential street connections. And so you see the black dashed lines here. This road here represents an extension of what is already River Drive up further, up in this area here, just jumping across the river and then following the western side of the river down and making a connection down in this location here. The crosshatched areas with green overlap, that is potential future public park or open space areas. Now, when we say public park, it could be anywhere from, maybe it's the city of Eden, maybe it's the city of Ogden Valley, whatever this community turns into in the future. Once there's a tax base, the city or the community will be able to self-govern. There'll be enough money for the city, for the community to be able to create a city, elect city council members and a mayor, and essentially keep going in the direction of a plan like this, or make whatever legislative alterations they want to in a plan like this. But once you get the tax base, you get the ability to self-govern. And then from there, the city could be looking at these community locations and say, well, you know, maybe we need some more soccer fields for our children playing, you know, soccer. Or maybe we need more natural areas with walking paths, or, you know, there's a whole host of things that the city could do in working in tandem with current landowners to implement some kind of an open space conservation area, incentivizing the ability for current landowners to keep their land open. And there are mechanisms to implement that as well. I want to take a break. Any questions about anything I've said so far?
I'm good.
Hey, sorry, I want to talk at you, but feel free to interrupt planning commissioners as questions might come up. I want to emphasize that as we're looking at this area and the kind of development that you see here, we're talking about at least 30 years. We're not talking about next year or even 10 years from now. Like I said in the beginning, or excuse me, a few minutes ago, if it's just this line here and this line here that's commercial with a little bit of residential on top over the next 5 or 10 years, that's great. It's one step towards a community outcome that is going to hopefully swallow up a large amount of development that would otherwise be spread out everywhere and move them into kind of more concentrated areas in favor of, this is again, development in favor of open spaces. Yes, the blue is government areas, just as an idea of the scale that we're looking at here, in case anyone's particularly concerned. You know, this isn't a downtown Ogden by any means. That's the junior high. That's how large the current junior high building is. That's the elementary school. That's how large the current elementary school is. That's an existing church house. That's how large an existing church house is. So when you're looking at the scale, we're actually talking about a pretty small area in comparison. And there's an existing church house out there as well. The brown buildings, the colors mean something here. So the brown buildings are buildings that exist today. The green buildings are, conceptually speaking, just very conceptual, the amount of density that could potentially be transferred here into the future. Some of these green buildings could be transferred here, or excuse me, could just be built in the area, because there are some lots that are still vacant out in these areas here. Not many, but a few. But the majority of these green buildings could potentially be transferred into the area. I'm not married to the Euclidean kind of polygons. I mean, if we're talking about a little bit more development in this area connecting Wolf Creek to Eden, possibility of finding a road link that goes up to the Wolf Creek area, so there's not just one way in and one way out in Wolf Creek, I think is important. Whether that be kind of going up this draw here, and this is a draw that has a creek that kind of comes down it, or coming up over this direction, that really is all up for grabs in the discussion. The other thing as far as transportation goes that this does is it takes your current major transportation corridor here, which we know in the future is probably going to need to be at least 1 lane wider with turn lanes as you move through, at least 100-foot right of way. In this village core and in this village core, it might even need to be 110 or 120-foot wide right of way. And that's currently the recommendation that the transportation engineers are telling us under existing trends. If we can transfer density from open space areas into these villages, those trends would kind of accelerate. So we'd see these get wider a little bit sooner. The line weight does mean something. So the thought is that this line here, again, over the next 30 years, at keeping pace with the development that is occurring, not getting out ahead of development, this line here would be essentially a main corridor as well as this line here and that line there. This does a couple of things. One of the main complaints that we heard in the Ogden Valley Plan was that there's only one way to get around. There's only, when you get any kind of a race that comes through these areas, it occupies the only road that anyone can use to get around in their community. We did suggest a little community bypass road that would kind of run along the foothills and run all the way out to the Huntsville area on the other side of the valley. And that was almost unanimously disagreed with by the public. The public really didn't want to see these current open areas opened up for more development with more road space. And so a solution to this is to look at the existing grid network that exists in the area. This distance from here to here is the same block distance as you see in downtown Huntsville. So let me just give you that example. It's the same distance, okay? So you're gonna have, I believe the distance from intersection to intersection is about 660 feet. So you're gonna see the same when you're getting down into these locations here. The small lines here would be, as you're looking in the commercial areas, they would be kind of your mid-block crossings or your alleyways to get into the interior of these buildings where parking should be. So you'll have parking along the street at a 45-degree angle where these commercial buildings are, and then parking on the interior. At some point in time, if commercial activity in this area is successful, landowners will choose to either bury their parking or put in parking complex. So, 2-story parking structure. which will allow them to put a little bit more building on their lot. Again, after sewer happens, I mean, before sewer happens, everyone's going to be planning for a huge amount of area for their septic systems to be located. But you provide other streets in the area that can get you around the community a little bit more effectively and efficiently if a street is occupied, closed, there's a crash, there's a race, or whatever. That's the idea behind these. Again, main road, once you get to these roads here, these would be just community neighborhood collectors, not huge roads, just ones that connect the neighborhoods. And again, these would be the mid-block alleyways or crossways here. Okay, looking at it from a street regulating plan perspective, that would look a lot more like this. So instead of focusing on the polygons of what is and isn't allowed in these specific areas, we would just be looking at coloring your roads a certain color and saying the color red means that your buildings aren't going to be set back very far from the street, that your street is going to be built to have a certain type of parking, bicycle infrastructure, sidewalks, area for street dining, area for public plazas or public gathering places, street trees, green areas, green space, flowers, street furniture. That's how we would have essentially a code or a regulation that says for a red line on the map, that means that that's a street-oriented commercial space which has these features. An orange line on the map, that means a multifamily residential space that has these features. A magenta line is a commercial-oriented streetscape, and it has these features. And so we would address this essentially through a street regulating plan, as opposed to the polygons that you saw on the last map. And then looking at that from a full build out perspective, just turning it into grayscale so the colors aren't misleading in the kind of density we're looking at. Again, we're talking about 2-story buildings. Yes, they are close together, but that's how we swallow up residential density on those second stories or in the multifamily housing, so that we can keep the open spaces open for large lot development or for conservation easement, etc. Another thing from a transportation planning perspective that we heard a lot from the public was we don't want to see any traffic lights, no traffic lights. Saying no traffic lights and actually providing for safety at intersections are two very different things. And UDOT's going to do what UDOT wants to do. And UDOT knows once you get to a certain volume at your intersections, you have to have a traffic light. Or the alternative to that is a roundabout. And so as we were chatting with the public during that general plan back in 2016, they said, all right, well, if we're going to get to certain volumes, traffic volumes at our intersections, let's focus on roundabouts. The roundabout is not the solution to all intersections, but I think it can be a solution to a couple of intersections that you guys have in the Eden area. The primary one being right here. This is that building right there is the current Maverick building. It's actually to scale. That's the current Maverick building, and they've got their canopy. They've got one canopy out here, and they've got one canopy right over here. This would be the roundabout right outside of that Maverick, the intersection of the Maverick right there, and the grocery store there. About the same scale. That's almost scaled correctly to what that roundabout would need to be. It might need to be just a little bit larger, but I've already been in communications with UDOT. They let us know that they've done a signal warrant study at this intersection, and as of, this was 3 years ago, as of 3 years ago, it warrants a signal. So UDOT is planning on putting a signal at this intersection unless, in cooperation with the county ponies up some money and offsets the cost to build a roundabout. So basically, UDOT, at that time, they're looking at $300,000 to $400,000 worth of improvements to signalize this intersection. They told us that they would hold off until we get our roundabout plans a little more secure, and then they'll put whatever money they would have otherwise put into signalizing this intersection, so $400,000 or $500,000, they'll put that into it. We build the rest. It's still going to be a UDOT roundabout, but the county would be responsible for building that infrastructure. That's their current take. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't get UDOT money to do a little bit more here in the future. But we do know that if we don't take some action on this soon, UDOT's just going to do what they need to do, which is put some traffic safety measures on this intersection here. Roundabouts are not great for pedestrians. They are not pedestrian friendly. There are a number of things that you can add to a roundabout to make them more pedestrian friendly. But at the end of the day, the safest way for pedestrians to interact with a roundabout is to go around it. And what I mean by that is, if you're going to put a crosswalk at this intersection, let's say you got a sidewalk that comes around here, you don't continue that crosswalk here. What you would do is you would bring your crosswalk, or you would bring your sidewalk down here, and then you would cross way down here. And so a pedestrian who wants to get from this corner here over to the grocery store would essentially need to walk back, cross, walk down, walk back, cross, and then get in. That's why they're not pedestrian friendly. Pedestrians don't typically want to do that. They just want to cross where they can. But when you've got a roundabout, you got free flow of traffic coming from here. Drivers are looking left. They're not looking right, getting into a roundabout. They're looking left to see where their in is between cars so they can merge in. And then as they get out again, they're just looking for the way to get out. They're not checking here for pedestrians, generally speaking. I'm not going to accuse all drivers of that. So if you move your crosswalk back, as your driver gets through the roundabout and is no longer negotiating getting out of that roundabout, then the driver becomes more alert and aware of people trying to cross the road. So that's one of the biggest challenges with roundabouts, is oftentimes you still get crossings right here and they're just not that safe. So how do we get a roundabout in a pedestrian oriented village? Well, that's one of the reasons why we looked at this area here and said, you know, this makes a little bit more sense to be vehicle oriented and not as pedestrian central. And then keep your pedestrian area off of these busier roads and kind of more isolated into these areas here, where we can have four-way intersections with stop signs and squared up crosswalks getting across the intersections, which essentially just keeps the line of travel for the pedestrian straight, which is, people are going to walk in a straight line even if you try and tell them to walk in on a curved line. They're going to still walk in a straight line if they can. The path of least resistance. The other roundabout would be this guy down in here. Now this guy is going to be a lot less based on traffic volume, at least today. The reason why we would want to see a roundabout here is to, as you've got a flow of travel coming into your village, a roundabout here is going to slow people down, generally speaking, as you come up closer to this intersection here. But it's also going to give people a free turn into this other village area, which is going to make this going right here just a little bit more inviting. Instead of just being put your blinders on, go straight on through like it currently is, having this opportunity here is going to make the choice to come in this way a little bit more convenient. And as you think about that, I mean, maybe not everyone's thought process goes that deep when they're thinking about the routes that they choose to take. But every time you break down just a constraint on choice, you open up an opportunity. And that's the kind of opportunities we'd be looking for to help people see that this area is just as important to go to as this area here. We would have wayfinding signs in this area here that essentially says, if you're going to go that way, you're going to get food and eateries and stuff like that. And if you go that way, you're going to get food and eateries and whatnot. So hopefully not developing this at the expense of this and vice versa. Okay, let's see. Okay, so we've talked a lot about city. Now let's talk about park. because we're trying to go for more park, less city. We did talk a little bit about these kind of green spaces in here, but every single one of these white dashed lines that you see would be a footpath. Maybe it's a paved pedestrian pathway like you currently see coming down Highway 158 and circling or almost getting closer to circling the reservoir, going all the way around. Maybe that's what these are. Maybe they're footpaths, nature paths. One really cool feature of a resort-oriented community, well, really, you've got any kind of community that has a good, strong downtown where people want to be, is a community garden. And maybe these are just footpaths through a community garden. In Breckenridge, Colorado, they've got a community garden. It's city space, it's city-owned land, but there's a gardening club that the community has, and people volunteer to be on the gardening club, and they go out and they plant this community garden, and it's gorgeous. They've got a cool pond in there, and you can walk around the pond, and kind of a nature center. It talks about the different plants that are there, talks about the ecology of the area, and the different kind of fish species and aquatic species and all that. Really kind of an entertaining area that, maybe that's here, or maybe it's in this location, or in one of these other green spaces. We'd be talking about a paved, probably paved, but if not, a nature pathway that goes along the riverway. We've already secured a pathway along the storage units that were approved over here in this area. So we've got at least the right of way to go through here. As development continues to occur along the riverway, we would want to continue to look at ways that we can get that pathway to occur. And as you can see, these pathways gonna go everywhere, and there are pathways surrounded by natural open spaces. Again, these natural open spaces that you're looking at today, somebody owns them. And so the key would be to work with existing landowners to either develop the land in a way that provides open areas and walking areas, or to develop some kind of incentive for the landowners to sell in favor of the open space and trails. Maybe it's transferable development rights like we were just talking about. Maybe it's through the park district. Maybe the park district uses some of the revenue that it can gather through its revenue generating mechanisms to acquire these properties. There are a bunch of different ways. We're going to set the goals. We're going to set the policies. We're going to and we'll set some implementation strategies through this small area plan. But at the end of the day, it's not, a lot of this may not be done by the county. A lot of this is more likely to be done by a local district or a local city once a municipality occurs. Okay. And then one last look at your street area. Let's, sorry, I don't have this open. I'm going to open I'm going to take a kind of a 3D look at what that could look like. Sorry, it's taking a minute to load.
Charlie, while you're doing that, I wanted to ask Cortland if he was able to fix his mic. I think it was a hot mic earlier for some reason. I was curious if he wanted to say something while we were just waiting here.
Okay, I unmuted. Is it any different now, or is it still super loud?
Wow, that sounds great.
I actually can't tell. Can you sing us a song?
I think it'd be better not to. So does it sound okay right now?
Yeah, it sounds good right now.
Cool, thanks.
Well, maybe while this is opening, maybe Steve, if you want to get going and, well, something's happening. Yeah, Steve, if you want to get going on this, I can come back and show this a little bit later.
Okay, sure. Let me share my screen here. Okay. So, as Charlie kind of, he went over a lot of, I think, higher level planning strategies that he talked about, and I guess what I wanted to present is kind of the actual words, the ordinance, which seems to be a little bit more boring than what Charlie was going over, but I'll try to make this as exciting as possible. So one thing I want to mention as we look through this is essentially it's a draft, and it's an incomplete draft of an ordinance that would allow an overlay zoning on top of the commercial zoning in the Eden areas, and that basically it would allow what Charlie described as these main streets to develop in a way that really helps the community looking at architecture and location of buildings. So I'll say this is just a draft. This is by no means complete. And it's really just the first draft that you're seeing of this ordinance that will essentially be a tool to implement this area. Sorry, I'm also hosting while I'm presenting here, so I might need to mute a few people. But one of the things that I want to mention also is we formulated this ordinance and this concept of this area plan that Charlie's described with what we call our Eden area steering committee. Now, it essentially started in the Old Town Eden area a few years ago. Probably, I think it was 2018 or 2019 that we initially met with some of the landowners, some of the commercial landowners and residents of that specific area. And we approached them with this question of, we wanted to know how critical the architecture and locations of the buildings are in this area. Because as you've seen, what's a lot of what's been built in these commercial areas are buildings that are set back quite a ways, that buildings that don't really have any architectural specifics that beautify the area, no real aesthetics. Recently, we've had a few developments come in, and we've said, hey, we've got this general plan. We would like you to put your building right up next to the street because we feel like it encourages a more walkable, pedestrian-friendly community. And our response has mostly been, no thanks. We have our business model, and we're going to put our building back as far as we can, and we're going to make the building the bare minimum architecturally what it needs to be under the code. So the response that we got from our steering committee was, yeah, we would like to strategically plan these specific streets to essentially be main streets. Now, as Charlie mentioned, obviously we're not thinking of downtown Ogden, but really just a few blocks of what would be considered a main street, meaning you'd have street front commercial retail, potentially with residential above the commercial retail. So we did get positive feedback from the steering committee that we met with, who said, yeah, let's go ahead and plan how these buildings will look. Let's make them look very specific to these areas. And let's also make sure we're getting a walkable community. And so what I've done is essentially started writing an ordinance that would allow that to happen if these areas were to be rezoned to what we would call like an Eden commercial or Eden village zoning. Charlie, I think, did yours load? Do you want to go over that before I go over the specifics of this ordinance?
It loaded, but not the way that I expected it to. So give me just a minute. Go on.
Well, why don't I share? I'm actually going to share a different screen really quick. Charlie, he'll show you what he came up with. He also came up with this, I think, initially just to show the Planning Commission as well as the steering committee what Eden could look like. So Charlie's a whiz at Photoshop, so he came up with this. But let me go through a few slides with you here. This is what we have currently. This is in the Newtown area. This is looking east. You can see the general store there. I'm going to go through a few slides to show you what this ordinance will create in this area, just as an example. And it would involve, I'll walk you through a little bit of these, but it would involve widening the right of way as well as the improved asphalt width. It would also involve what you've got here are some traffic calming. They call them bulb outs. Basically, if you're standing on this, people are going to start to slow down because they're going to realize buildings are going to be closer together. There's going to be people grouped together. So it's a traffic calming measure for drivers. You got wide sidewalk here, somewhere between, I think, 18 to 14 feet wide sidewalks here. You can also see that there's going to be curb and gutter. You've got a bike path here, about, I think, between 4.5 to 6 feet wide would be the bike path. You've got raised intersection, or you could potentially do what appears to be a raised intersection just with different material in the street, or even in just different colors in the street. Okay, so here's where the ordinance would start to require developers to put their buildings right along the street front. Again, that is kind of a traffic calming measure together with the sidewalk and the bulb out. It also, if the buildings look really nice, it's a nice feature for pedestrians and people driving by to see how nice the buildings can look. We're gonna have some street features like benches and potentially some street dining. That's why we're thinking we would need to make the sidewalk as wide as possible. And you can see that obviously that's what it would look like with people and pedestrians and bicyclists there. Thought would be to also have street trees. We would want to make sure that it's an appropriate size of street tree that's not going to ruin the sidewalk and not require a ton of maintenance. But we also, the trees provide just a little bit of a nicer aesthetic, more of a welcoming and inviting place for pedestrians to walk, a little bit of a separation between pedestrians and vehicles. And then the idea would be to have some kind of angled parking along the streets. That's essentially what it could look like in that area if we were to adopt a little bit more of a well thought out and strategic zoning in this area. Charlie, did yours load?
I think so.
You want to share yours?
Yeah, okay. Let's see. Can you see this okay?
Yeah.
So this obviously isn't perfect. You can kind of see how the aerial imagery currently is. So it's not quite aligned perfectly, but just imagine this road comes in, lines up here, this road comes in, lines up here, and so forth. This is still a work in progress. Essentially, let's go into, this is your, so let's just zoom out just a little bit. Newtown Eden intersection is here. So you're kind of following Old Highway 162. This is generally speaking where it curves right here. And then this whole thing is set a whole block up actually, because this is the intersection here. So right now, let's forget about the aerial imagery. So let's pretend right now for a second that this is the general store location right here. This is the park. If we were to kind of rotate a little bit and look over in this location, this is the blacksmith shop here, and the other building that the blacksmith village has created here. And as you kind of go in and you look at any one of these viewports, I'm going to flip around. As you look at any one of these potential viewports here, one main thing that's missing. Now these are 2-story buildings, so they're not huge buildings. The street lights are night sky compliant street lights, where you've got the lighting device up here and it just shines down. And let me turn on a couple of layers. These are the layers that make it really clunky. So after I turn these on, I'm probably not going to be able to move things around much, but let me kind of get a better view here. Trees, and now it looks like the street furniture has been disabled, but so as the trees load, let me kind of give you a little bit of idea of what we're looking at. We're looking at 12-foot wide lanes. We're looking at bicycle facilities on both sides. We're looking at the pedestrian facilities on both sides. Where you see the street lights located, and looks like I got a couple of doubled up, I didn't mean to put in, but where you see the street lights located, that would be the tree yard as well as the street furniture yard. And when I say yard, it's just kind of another way of saying park strip, I guess. So you'll have your trees, your lighting, and your street furniture kind of down the same alignment here. And then between the building facade and your furniture, you'll have your primary pedestrian area. In your primary pedestrian area, as well as inside of your tree line here, you'll have the opportunity for street dining, street shopping. You might have outdoor rentals. You might have bicycle parking areas. You've also got 45-degree angle parking here. As you're looking kind of down this area, turn the street furniture on. These intersections here, now I'm turning street furniture on, it's bogging it down, but these intersections here are raised intersections. So typical curb and gutter, you've got your street surface that kind of crowns and then goes down into a gutter here. And then you got a 6-inch lift that gets you to the top of your sidewalk. These intersections are actually raised to the same level as the sidewalk. People don't have to step off the curb into the street and back out again. Instead, because it's street oriented or pedestrian oriented, this is all designed for pedestrians. And the cars are the incidental uses. Now, that doesn't mean that this is intended to inhibit cars' ability to pass through that highway area as it is right now. People will be able to pass through just fine. The asphalt will come, it'll ramp up 6 inches here, which we've been working with the roads crew to verify that they're comfortable with their plows just going up that lip. It's not a huge lip. Plowing up, and then they would plow straight across here and then drop down the other side. Again, bringing the street up to the level of the sidewalk does a lot for ADA accessibility. It does a lot for essentially, psychologically speaking, and internal thought patterns thinking. It tells a community that this is about walking. This is a community that's designed for people, not just a community designed for cars. You're not afraid to cross the road in these areas because you're aware that it's been designed to keep drivers' minds alert to pedestrian opportunities. Again, like Steve mentioned, those bulb outs helps visually as you're thinking about the kind of roads that you just have a habit of pushing your gas pedal down on. They're not generally speaking roads that have these kind of bulb outs that come out to the travel lane. They're the roads that are just wide lanes and then nothing on the sides. And you've just got a wide open space to push the gas pedal down because you feel safe doing that. And you feel like you're keeping other people safe doing that. Even if the speed limit is marked at 40, you might find yourself doing 50 or 55 in those areas. The street design has everything to do with your psychological perception of how it's intended to be used. And if you create a freeway and you tell someone to go 25 miles an hour on it, you're just not going to get that response from people using it. In fact, our freeways are currently designed at 75 miles an hour in many places, and people are going 80, 85 because it feels comfortable to do that. If you create a streetscape that tells a driver, this is what's happening here, be alert, the drivers will be alert. So, I mean, these would be four-way intersections, four-way stop signs. We wouldn't be proposing any kind of traffic lights in these areas. And you can get a lot of traffic movement through here. Now, it's entirely possible once we get to some of these intersections, if this plan is successful, it's possible that you need a center left-hand turn lane and maybe even a shoulder right-hand turn lane. But one of the reasons why we're looking at, if you drive down Grant Promenade, Grant Avenue here in downtown Ogden area, that's probably a pretty close example of what we're potentially looking at here. Now, what they did on Grant is between the asphalt and the bike lane, they planted bioswales. So the water from the hard surface can flow into those bioswales. And then on the other side of that, you get the bike lane. These are a little bit different because what these will do is they'll keep the bike lane up on the curb lip. And then as the vehicle would approach the intersection, whether that be back here or up here, there would be the opportunity for the vehicle and the bike lane to essentially share the space. So as you have someone who's turning right, they could occupy this space as long as it's not currently being occupied by a cyclist or a pedestrian. It does bring the pedestrian crosswalks back here a bit, but that is directly in line with the primary pedestrian corridor. So pedestrians aren't going out of their way or having to go out of their way to get to their primary, their destined location or designed location to cross the streets. So people would essentially come up this 6-inch lip. It's really a very mild incline going from the asphalt to the crosswalk. But it's enough that people can see it visually, see that there's something different, and slow down whether or not the crosswalk is occupied. They'll ramp up, they'll be on the intersection, and they'll ramp back down. Now I'm suggesting here in color that we have a different kind of surface treatment of the intersection. And you could see these different types of surface treatments in different small downtown villages across the country. And I think we've got a couple of them here in the Ogden area. When you make the intersection look different, you are telling the driver as they're approaching the intersection, something is happening here, slow down and use caution. And so whether this is stamped concrete, I mean, that's expensive when you're looking at the difference between asphalt and concrete, or it's just colored asphalt. Either way, providing something different in this transition where these intersections are is going to be important. So this is one of the primary intersections at the corner of the park. When you come down the road just a little bit, this is not a primary intersection. This would be something a little bit more like a mid-block crossing where, and Steve will show you kind of our ideas about alleyways, but where you've got an alleyway that gets you to the middle of your block here where you've got a parking area here. This alleyway is maybe 35, 40 feet wide maximum. It's not a big area. It can flow pedestrians and vehicles to and from their cars and back out onto the right of way. A lot of criticisms about this kind of street design, especially when it comes to novice transportation engineers, would say that this is not good for semi-trucks. Well, number one, we wouldn't want semi-trucks going in through these areas anyway, but even if you get back to this here, this is actually one of the more large radii that AASHTO suggests. This radius here is actually very conducive if you have a semi here to turn and keep the rear wheels of that trailer inside of the intersection and not crossing over this line. It's actually a pretty wide radius. You just can't tell that because everything's kind of been sucked down to make it appear as if everything is a lot more narrow. But again, if you've got a Cisco delivery truck coming down, you're gonna be able to navigate that curve pretty simply. In fact, another way to think about it is if you did have a right-hand turn lane on many other streets that you're familiar with, you're still gonna see that semi out here with his blinker on to turn right so that they can actually navigate that curve. So that's how wide that curve there is. So the mid-block, excuse me, again, intended to get people access to the vehicles and to parking in the middle. And if the street-oriented retail actually takes off, if the market really runs with it, maybe there's underground parking and actual multifamily housing here in the middle, which would again further support the service industry and retail operations of the area. Any questions, comments, thoughts, hate mail? Okay. Steve, back to you.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen real quick and I'll just walk you through this draft ordinance. So like many of the zones in our zoning ordinances, you'll see it typically begins with a purpose and intent. Here, we're just saying that, purpose and intent is to carry out the general plan, the Ogden Valley general plan that talks about small area plans and the village areas, making them pedestrian friendly and implementing some kind of more strict aesthetic requirements. We've also got an applicability section and planning commissioners, you can let me know if you'd like me to read it word for word. I feel like we probably, I know we will once we get to a point where we're having a public hearing on this. But basically it says this is going to apply to the Eden commercial areas. And it will probably have some language in here also at some point about the area plan, the regional area plan that Charlie's, his maps that he referenced. Permitted uses, we talked earlier about, we will need to look at the uses that are currently listed in our commercial zones in a little bit greater detail. But as Charlie mentioned, in a form-based zoning like this, there's less of a focus on the use and more of a focus on the street. So what we've gotten here right now is essentially this is, I'll admit, this is kind of more of a placeholder right now at this point in writing this ordinance, but it says, refer to the uses that are listed in the commercial zoning. Site development standards. This ordinance will also have site development standards, talking about minimum and maximum as far as the lot areas go, lot frontages. So you can see here, minimum lot area is going to be 0. There's not going to be any minimum lot width. There will not be a required lot width. And this really comes down to when a owner or developer plats their property, they'll need to follow this as far as, the way their lots look. Front yard setback. Typically, this isn't something that you see in the county, but we have a maximum front yard setback. A lot of times you'll just see minimum, but here again, with the intent of pushing the buildings as close as we can to the street. We're saying maximum is 5, but you can do more if you wanted to do like a patio or dining area. Minimum front, none, provided, however, any building proposed to be set back more than 5 feet shall be set back a minimum of 60 feet. The intent behind that is if somebody wants to develop something that won't be street front, we will say, okay, you can still put that on the property. It's just that we need to reserve the area for street front retail and commercial. Minimum side, we're saying none, with the idea it would be that a lot of these properties will be these commercial properties and won't need to have a setback from each other unless it is adjacent to an agricultural or residential zone. Then we're saying it'd be 10 feet. Minimum rear setback would be 0, again, unless it's adjacent to a commercial or residential or agricultural zone. It would be, sorry, that should say 10, not 10. Maximum building height, we were just thinking somewhere it could be 45 feet. As we mentioned, this really is going to be tailored to those specific streets, not necessarily the entire village area. And so really we're thinking closer to the intersection, 45 feet. It could be a little bit taller, it could be a little bit less tall, but we want to have enough area for there to be several levels, at least 2, potentially 3 levels. Minimum building depth for the first story street facing commercial space, 30 feet. So that'd be the building would have a depth of 30 feet from the street back into the lot, 30 feet. Here we're saying minimum building width for street facing commercial is 75% of a lot's street frontage. We're thinking the other 25% would probably be taken up by an alleyway or some kind of sidewalk or walking path. Minimum building fenestration for first story street facing commercial space. So that's really just how much window space is going to need to be taken up. And we're saying 65% of the area of the facade. So the street front needs to have street front of the building needs to have 65% of that area as windows, or not necessarily windows into space, but could potentially be something that looks like windows, maybe fake windows. Moving on into the ordinance, we're looking at, we mentioned several times the width of this street, how the street should be developed. So some language we've got here. As development occurs on each parcel, the owner shall dedicate area for public right-of-way to form a block pattern within the village area as depicted by the street cross-section below. As we've looked at existing right-of-way in these areas, we're thinking we probably need about 100 feet in order to make this work at a minimum. You see here 14-foot sidewalk, 4.5-foot bike path, and close to 20, so 19.5 feet of an area for 45-degree angle parking and a 12-foot travel lane. We mentioned also a few times these mid-block alleyways to be able to provide some parking areas and access to other buildings that might not be street front. So we've got just kind of a street plan here showing where the main streets will be, as well as these internal alleyways. I've got a typo here. This should probably say 33 feet, but this could be this is essentially what the alleyways will look like. It could be a little bit different, but 12 feet of driving surface and a 4.5-foot sidewalk. We've got parking standards in here. We say separate from street parking, you whatever building you propose needs to have, you need to provide sufficient parking so that we're not clogging up the streets with street parking. So each application is going to need to have some kind of parking plan that shows that with on-street and off-street parking, there won't be any issues. Going down to street trees, we've looked at this pretty heavily. We've met with an arborist, a tree planner, whatever you want to call them, to tell us kind of how this should be worded and maybe even what kind of trees should be in this area. So essentially this section says that we will require some kind of street tree plan as part of a building permit. We want to know what type of trees you're going to be planting, what the type of planting method is, and those will need to be approved by the planning director and the county engineer, so that we know that it fits in with what's existing. And it also is going to be required to submit a tree maintenance plan with that building permit. This is just kind of gives you a general idea of what we're thinking. There should be 7 feet of clearance above a sidewalk and 12 feet above a bike path or parking area. Okay, we talked about the 14-foot sidewalk on either side of the street that will be in the right-of-way, in that 100-foot right-of-way. We want it to blend into, we don't want a hodgepodge of sidewalk. We want it to blend in nicely. So we'll expect to see some kind of a sidewalk plan submitted with any kind of a building permit. Here is just your standard curb and gutter cross section that we'll expect to see installed. Now that could change depending on kind of what our engineers come back with, but they've seemed to think that this standard curb and gutter section is acceptable. I mentioned the bike path. There's required to have the developer install a 4.5-foot bike path. We also mentioned the angled parking in here. It's a requirement of the ordinance to provide angled parking. Charlie went over these bulb outs pretty extensively. This image is kind of a placeholder. We'll probably need to get into our, we'll design a better image that reflects what a developer will need to do if they're on a corner or if they're on a mid-block area where we would expect to see some traffic calming measures. But we will have that in the ordinance that says it is a requirement if you are in these areas to provide that. So here's kind of, I guess, the funner part of the ordinance where we get into the way the buildings need to look. We've separated that into Old Town Eden and New Town Eden. So again, Old Town would be where the general store, the blacksmith shop, and the Eden Park are, and then New Town obviously is where the Maverick is and the grocery store. So here we say street front buildings shall have architectural styles and materials that resemble historic commercial Main Street buildings from the era of the late 1880s to the early 1910s. We talk about we say diversity. We don't want all the same building to be there. We want there to be a pretty good diversity. We also want there to be we want gable roofs to be hidden, kind of like this image here you see is kind of like an old Western type commercial area. Charlie was making fun of me earlier because you can see the wagon. I should have found a different picture, but I think as we go through these, you'll get the idea. Here's a good example of diversity. Now, obviously these buildings, the building on the right is a little bit dilapidated.
I like the wagon. You should leave the wagon and make it mandatory.
Wagon parking is required. Obviously this building is dilapidated, but you can kind of see the idea of diversity in that era that we pointed out, late 1880s to early 1910s. You see a lot of brick. You also see a lot of wood. So we'd expect to see some kind of diversity there with those two types of materials. Here you've got a building that's more kind of the wood looking building. It looks kind of like the general store in Eden. Here you've got more of the brick type of building. You can see that the gable roofs are all hidden here by this false front that looks really nice. Part of Old Town Eden, we're saying it needs to have a base, a body, and a cap. As you can see, we've shown here a good example. You could look at the blacksmith shop. It's got a great example of a base, body, and cap. But just to show whoever might be reading this ordinance to know our regulations in the future, we wanted to specify what those were. Here's another example of what those buildings could look like in Old Town Eden. Colors should represent that era. Natural colors of wood and brick and the natural metal patina are examples of acceptable colors. Other colors like white can be used for accent colors that make the building, maybe the windows, it makes it stick out a little bit and look nice. When we get to Newtown, here's what we have written so far. Buildings shall implement agrarian style agriculture. Buildings in Newtown Eden shall incorporate barn elements such as pitched roof and wood or metal siding. In Newtown Eden, street-facing building facades that do not use natural wood siding shall incorporate a brick or stone wainscot as a building base. And here's a few examples. And again, we don't need to use these. I just Googled fancy barns. It was really hard to find a barn type building as a commercial street fronted building. But I think it would look really cool if these were shown as Main Street buildings. Here's a few examples of the architecture that those buildings could look like with the wood and barn style that we pointed out. Here you've got some good window fenestration that isn't on these other buildings necessarily. You got a little bit here. This is an example of maybe a back of a building. If maybe somebody wanted to put an auto mechanic shop or something, and that could potentially be the back of a building, and wouldn't necessarily be the street front. So colors, we're saying have them be earth tone, natural colors. Red can be used. Obviously, red is a prominent color for barns. White shall be used as an accent color around windows and other openings. We feel like the white kind of just makes it look a lot more aesthetically pleasing, as you can see in that image there. That's as far as we've gotten, really. There's a little bit more detail we need to provide in writing this ordinance, but we just really wanted to show you that we're working on a few things, and we'll hopefully have this ordinance ready to finalized and tailored to bring back to you in the next few months. But that's all I had.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah. Charlie, do you have anything else?
No, actually, I don't. So we were, well, you know what? Let's see, what time is it? 6:46. Maybe just as a precursor, I just wanted to make sure the planning commissioners were thinking about where density should be coming from, like the lands that should be preserved as open space, and where it should be going to. I am creating a TDR ordinance. I want to make sure everyone understands how it's going to be, or how it can be constructed or implemented. So I'm going to share my screen here. Now we could do it a few different ways. We could do it just based on zoning, and we could look at the 83 areas and the F5 areas and the F40 zones and say, all right, in this zone, maybe this is a sending zone or a receiving zone, or a sending zone or receiving, or sending or receiving. But I think what's probably more appropriate, and we do have a map in the general plan that talks a little bit about the open lands that currently exist. So what our consultants did at that time is they looked at all the properties that are 10 acres or larger that doesn't have a lot of development on it. And they colored them green. And essentially that was kind of the baseline of, these are 10 acres or greater with not much on it, probably land that's worth consideration for preserving as open space. And then obviously our commercial nodes would be where the density should be funneled into. I'm going to guess, like I mentioned earlier, that the county commissioners are going to be a little more on the flexible side of mandating transfers versus encouraging them. Obviously, to get more density in the center, a developer would be required to go get more density, but to move it off of open lands, I think what we're going to see is something a lot closer to strong encouragement as opposed to any kind of a mandate. So if a landowner has been sitting on a piece of property thinking, you know, this is my investment property, I am going to develop this in the future, I think it's very likely that we'll still see development on that land. Whether it be the full development potential or some fraction of that is yet to be seen, as decided by the county commissioners. I think some of the obvious areas for receiving commercial is going to be outside of the village areas, is going to be areas that are within close proximity to existing infrastructure. And one of the reasons I say that, and maybe in part it's counterintuitive, but in other parts it's going to be more intuitive, is because if you've already got the existing infrastructure, you don't have to build more roads or more streets to get to that particular location. Meaning, number one, it's going to be more advantageous to the landowner that's in proximity to that road because it's not going to be so expensive. And number two, for every single linear foot of lane miles that you put down, there is a tax implication, a tax liability to the general taxpayer. It doesn't hurt as bad as it probably should to a lot of the Valley residents now. When I say hurt, I mean the amount of money that goes into operating and maintaining the roads that exist currently that are paved up in that area, because there's, generally speaking, a bigger pot to pull from on a lot of that. But when you get down to the municipal services in general, if the Valley residents were paying a foot per foot amount for the streets that you see up there, there just wouldn't be enough money to operate and maintain the streets that even exist. So what I'm referring to here is that residential development will very rarely ever pay for itself in terms of tax base. Even if you've got very expensive property where you've got a very large amount of tax coming from it, first off, if it's primary residential, it's almost for sure not going to pay for itself in terms of infrastructure and operations. Again, we're not just talking about streets in the future, we're talking about streets, sewer, water, all of the utilities that go into it. Whereas commercial areas, they more than pay for themselves. In fact, they help offset the liability of residential areas. And this is why you get a lot of municipalities really kind of going after some of those commercial locations. They want that Walmart, not to say Walmart should ever be located in the Valley, please don't, but they want that Walmart because they can see the tax dollars coming in to help pay for that residential subdivision that was installed 10 or 20 years ago that's fallen apart. Okay. And so looking at where existing roads are and not expanding the existing road network is going to be good for the existing landowners along those streets. It's going to be good for the future taxpayer. It's also going to be good for your open space preservation plan. The more roads you put through those fields, the easier it is to access the development potential of land that's further away from the existing street network. And so it's a good open space preservation plan just to, generally speaking, not want to see a ton of new roads. Now, I speak that out of one side of my mouth. I know a lot of the other side of my mouth has been saying for the last couple of years, street connectivity, and the more connections you get in your neighborhoods, the better off and the more vibrant and the more interconnected and sociable your neighborhoods are going to be in the future. There's a balance. And we got to figure out what that balance is. But generally speaking, if we're not seeing huge roads cutting up the hillside to provide for development up in here, but more likely roads that kind of are built in the general proximity of existing roads to provide for development potential, you're going to get better outcomes in the future for preservation of open space, for limiting the amount of linear miles you see in asphalt, thereby limiting the liability that you see in terms of the amount of miles built. And so my suggestion would be to focus in on where your existing roads are and say, okay, these are potential receiving areas. Now, we don't want those receiving areas to debase the opportunity of where we really want our receiving areas to be, okay? And so when we're looking at our receiving areas in these more village-oriented locations, I haven't put a cap, and I haven't even started to think through a cap on how dense these can be. I am thinking that we shouldn't allow them to go more than 2 stories for residential purposes. I mean, maybe we get a 3-story here at the intersection like Steve was mentioning, but I think that would be limited to this location here if the community was comfortable with it. But in terms of how many units should be located here, I think that height should be the limit that we're looking at. That is going to limit, from a development perspective, how many units can go in there. And then let the developer kind of decide what they can fit. If you leave it open-ended that way, you're gonna find in the economy of scale, when a developer comes in and says, on this particular piece of property, they're gonna tell me I can't go taller than 35 feet or 2 stories, but they're not gonna tell me how many I can put in here. The developer is gonna figure out how to do their geometry the way they need to do it to maximize their profit. And if they can do that in the economy of scale, the probability that they pick up more development rights off of open lands and move them to the property is going to be a lot higher. Whereas if we put a false cap on that and say, we don't want to see any more than 35 units on that particular property, the economy of scale that the developer could potentially realize isn't going to be there. Now, again, going back to the previous maps that we were looking at, I do think that we should say, all right, if we're looking at multifamily, maybe we're not putting a cap on it, but as you get further out from that center, that's where we're going to put limits on lot sizes to say, all right, this is single family, quarter acre, single family, half acre, single family, full acre, single family, 3 acre and above. That'll put those limitations on the surrounding area. But where you've got that commercial space and the multifamily space, I don't suggest saying no more than X number of density. Just saying any new density needs to be pulled in from somewhere else. Okay, that said, as you look at where the existing streets are, there is a possibility to get a little more density in those locations. Now, we could potentially say, if you've got the land and you want to buy up density, go ahead and put your density on your land and buy it up from other people. That is an option. That option leads to the possibility of a market churning for transferable development rights, which we do need that market to churn so that we can get some stability in pricing points. So a developer generally knows what it's going to cost them, especially when looking at developing a village location. What is it going to cost me to go out and get transferable rights? That way, when they're running through their pro forma and trying to figure out, is my profit margin 5%? Is it 10%? Is it 20%? They've got a better understanding, and that's going to lead to a level of predictability. That's going to lead to a level of dependability in terms of what the outcome might be. But there's a negative to that, and the negative to that is in terms of predictability and dependability. When we're looking at anyone who has land could receive, as long as they're buying from somewhere that we like, well, you might get a little bit more density in locations that you're not otherwise anticipating. So again, anticipating a little more density around the park and maybe up in this location here, but as you get further out, I think even the amount of density that the town of Huntsville has, 1 dwelling unit to the acre, is going to feel, for some people, it's going to feel like that's not enough elbow room, and there's still going to be a desire for 3 acre lots and 5 acre lots on the outskirts. And so my suggestion is we've got 3 different transferable development right overlay zones. And this is the code I'm currently writing that we'll be hopefully addressing when we have our work session in 2 months. Transferable, so the first zone, TDR, so transferable development right, TDRS, the S stands for sending. That's a sending area only. If there's going to be any TDR activity, it's sending from that area. Now, again, I do think that the end result is that the county commission is probably going to want to be encouraging and not mandating. And so the landowner, if they've got one development right, they've got the opportunity to either build that house there, which we can say is predictable because we got one dwelling unit every 3 acres on in this color and in this color. So there is a predictability there. Or they can build it, or they could sell it. And if they sell it, that preserves at least 3 acres of land in that particular area. And they would need to sell it to a zone that is allowed to be receiving. The village areas, we would put a polygon around those areas and say, these are our TDR-R zones, transferable development right receiving zones. So if you're within an overlay zone that says you can receive, we would have the rules of what those zones are. And if you're in, your multifamily areas that we kind of design and set aside, maybe it's TDR, no limit on how many you can receive, but you can't go taller than 2 stories. Maybe if you're out here in a 1/4 acre or 1/2 acre or 1 acre, it's TDR, but no more TDRs built in this area than what you can get out of this lot size. And then comes the third zone, which is the hybrid zone. It's both the sending and receiving zone. My suggestion there is once we've got sewer in this area, to allow somewhere between 1/2 acre and 1 acre zones, 1/2 acre and 1 acre lot sizes in a lot of these areas that are within a certain proximity of existing streets. I say 1/2 acre to 1 acre because I'm pretty open to that. 1 acre takes people back to what the density was and what the predictability of density was from the 1990s. And so that might not be too challenging to swallow. It also gets us to about the same density that you see in a town of Huntsville block. 1/2 acre, you can get double. So, I mean, you see these are, let's see, that one is a 0.75 acre parcel. And with this 0.75 acre, you get about 8 in a block. Okay, so if you go down to 1/2 an acre, you might be able to get 10 or 12 in that block. Okay, so you can kind of get an understanding of density in terms of predictability. So if you buy property, let's just say here, and you buy a 3 acre parcel and you expect everything to be wide open because everyone around you is going to have 3 acres. This gentleman has 9 acres here. Okay, so let's just say you buy a 3 acre parcel right here, and you know that he can't get any more than 3 homes on this property, 1, and then maybe 1 here and 1 here. That's the predictability you're looking for when you're investing in property, right? What is my view going to be? Who's going to come in and block it? What's going to happen next door? And how close together are these houses going to be? What's my elbow room going to be? So we would say in this particular area that maybe it's 1 acre, maybe it's 1/2 an acre. That's really up for grabs for the planning commission to play with. Maybe it's 2 acres, and say, all right, someone with property can get, whether it's, let's just say 1/2 acre, 1/2 acre lots in here, as long as every single one of those lots are transferred or rights are transferred in to create the 1/2 acre. The guy who moves into his 3 acre parcel, he would then have a level of predictability knowing maybe they put in 1/2 acre lots next door, maybe they don't. But if they do, at some point in time in the future, I've got 3 acres and all I got to do is play the TDR game and I can get 6 lots on my property too. And so that guy has some kind of an idea of predictability for the future. What can I'm investing in this land. Maybe I'm investing it for the long term. Maybe I'm investing in it for until my neighbor develops, and then I'm going to develop too, and I'm going to cut bait and move out to a bigger property somewhere. That is the kind of predictability that I'm hoping that we see. Because if we have that predictability, we've got 2 things. We've got predictability in the market, and then we've got predictability in expectations of what's going to happen next door. Zoning is set up in order to create predictability in what's going to happen next door. And so we don't, if we move away from that, we're just creating a scenario where things are going to be painful for landowners in areas that we're not we're just not anticipating. You're going to find a piece of property that you thought was always going to be open, all of a sudden has more homes on it than you have ever expected. So again, that is the 3 TDR overlay zone concept: TDR receiving, TDR sending, and then TDR hybrid, which is sending and receiving, where they could just transfer at their leisure. The other thing that we need to talk about, and that I want planning commissioners, you guys to really think hard about, we already know that in the resort areas, we're okay with that being receiving. Out of sight, out of mind. Yes, there's a lot of impact in these resort areas to the natural environment, but from what I've heard, if we can get them out of the valley floor and move them out to the areas where we can't see them as much, the pastoral lifestyle of preserving the valley floor is more important. And the more we can get out of the valley floor, it's almost as if we're just retiring it, even though we still have an impact up on the hillside. I don't think that's a bad perspective to take. I mean, we don't want to overdevelop our mountainsides. That's not good news, but as long as we allow for more development to go in appropriate locations in the mountainside, I think we can essentially virtually make it feel like we're retiring development rights on the valley floor. I'm going to give you an example, and I'm not going to tell you exactly where this is because I'm not quite sure the developer is ready for it yet, but you will be seeing this in a work session pretty soon as a rezone. There is a landowner, he's in the F40 zone. He would like to be rezoned to, I think we're looking at the potential of doing the FV3 zone or similar. And the reason he wants to rezone is he wants to do a development agreement, and he wants to put, he's along a roadway that leads to a resort. Let's just put it that way. He wants to put in condominiums in that area. He's looking at the potential of doing 4 or 5 buildings with the potential of maybe 8 units per building. He knows he's going to have to transfer. We're already working with him on transferable development rights, and he's actually already working with a couple of different prospective sellers on selling their rights. Where we don't currently have a TDR code, what we would do is essentially we would downzone, in effect, the property that's sending those development rights, and we would upzone the developer's property. In exchange for allowing those condominiums or those townhomes, the developer is proposing quite a bit of their 40-acre parcel to be preserved as open space. I think that's actually probably a pretty good idea in terms of how the TDR plan could work. Because then you've got a few townhomes that are being located off of a road that is already experiencing growth, resort-oriented growth. You got a developer who's able to realize a little bit of a benefit being in proximity to a resort, or at least on the roadway towards a resort. And you've got the rest of the community realizing the benefit of losing, what did he say, 8 and 5, 40 development rights off the valley floor and moving it into a very small footprint somewhere where they can't see. Still get a little bit of the same, you'll still get the impact of traffic going up to that area on that main highway. Fortunately, it's a UDOT highway, but I think that is a good outcome. So when we're looking at the F40 zones, the F5 zones, well, I'm going to come back to F5 in a second. So the F40 zones, the F10 zones, kind of the mountain land or the hinterland areas, if the development is compact and it's along an area where you're not building huge roadways across sensitive natural lands with wildlife corridors or with ridge lines or water quality impacts, why not allow a few little small compact resort communities to pop up in those particular areas at the benefit of the whole by keeping the more pastoral lifestyle for the valley floor. And so that might be TDR overlay zone 4, mountain land receiving area. I still haven't fully fleshed that out yet, but bear with me as I continue to think through this. I want to get a general understanding from the commissioners in the meeting right now. Planning commissioners, FR1, just the canyon. My thought is there's not a lot of room for more development. We shouldn't allow more development there. And I think it should be a sending area only. So the possibility of someone who wants to develop in a resort area, or maybe a little bit more density in one of the sending/receiving hybrid zones, or moving it up into the hinterlands, could potentially come to landowners here, purchase their development rights, and move the potential of additional development going on in the canyon up into a more appropriate location. Does that sound like an okay idea, or does that sound like a terrible idea?
Seems like an awfully hard place to develop, so I would encourage you to move it and cluster it somewhere else and not jam up the corridor.
The Ogden Valley General Plan does anticipate that this should be in the future, and I know UDOT has a huge influence on this. It should be more of a recreation corridor than a transportation corridor. And I think you're right. The less homes we get in here, the more recreation oriented we can make the land uses in that area. Planning commissioners, any other ideas or thoughts on that?
So this is Commissioner Torman. So what's UDOT's plan for, I mean, if we're increasing the population threefold in the next 30 years, potentially, I mean, is Ogden Canyon still going to be a main corridor, or is it going to transfer over to Trappers Loop? Or, I mean, what is their plan? Because right now it's pretty busy. And that's just a concern as a Valley resident that, you know, it's already getting pretty jammed up just with those two main corridors coming up. I mean, do they have a master plan of what they're doing there?
Yes and no. Let me tell you what our plan is, and then what I understand UDOT is planning out. So the Ogden Valley General Plan, you're not alone in your concern there. The Valley residents brought that up as a big concern. And the majority of the recreation public that is coming in the area, we did find that the majority of that traffic is coming from Davis and Salt Lake areas. You don't get a ton coming south from north of here, and other than locals, the majority is coming from Davis and Salt Lake. So there's no reason for them, the majority of the drivers, to use the valley. A lot of people, or excuse me, to use the canyon. A lot of people want to use the canyon because they're towing a boat and they don't want to go up over the hill. A lot of people don't want to use the canyon because they're towing a boat or trailer and they don't want to bump into the sides. And so it's kind of a preference on the individual users. You get a lot more cement trucks wanting to go up this direction because it's easier to get up the hill than trying to get up over Trappers Loop. But UDOT's goal in creating Trappers Loop was to alleviate the demand on the canyon. And it frankly was the only other way in. And also it was very convenient that it happened to pop up right before the Winter Olympics and the events that was happening up at Snow Basin. So it just made it easier for them to invest all that money into it. That said, it has been alleviating traffic, but it hasn't reduced it. We know that Ogden Canyon is at a very high percentage of capacity. I mean, it's up in the high 80s, if not low 90% capacity on average, whereas Trappers Loop is somewhere around 14% capacity on average. And so we're still not as successful as we can be in getting traffic to use the Trappers Loop here. The Ogden Valley General Plan says we want to see a recreation corridor, and what the county should do is develop policies to work with UDOT to avoid use of the Ogden Canyon as much as possible. One implementation strategy we're actually almost to fruition. We're putting in vehicle wayfinding signage, and there are a number of signs that will be going in, one of which, if you're at the intersection at the dam, there is a wayfinding sign right here that says Ogden this way, Huntsville that way, for people who are looking to turn left or right. That sign, by the end of this year, will also say Salt Lake City that way. Now, I wanted it to say Layton that way, but UDOT said it's got to be Salt Lake City. It's the next biggest thing to sign. So hopefully pushing people who are going to Davis County, who are going to Salt Lake County, to go towards Trappers Loop, not down Canyon. And then we've got the wayfinding signs that are also coming in. We'll have another one located just before Trappers that says Salt Lake City, Mountain Green. And we'll have one in this location here that also says Salt Lake City, Mountain Green up this direction here. So that's one mechanism. Another thing that our general plan suggests is to work with UDOT on electronic messaging signs. And UDOT is actually working on that with the reconstruction of Highway 89. They will be creating vehicle messaging signs or VMS signs that go over the freeway that tell distances. And so they'll be able to explain to the public in those distances that the distance to, or excuse me, the time to Powder Mountain is, maybe it's half an hour if you go Trappers Loop and 45 if you go Ogden Canyon. That'll really help people change their minds as well. What I think should happen, I'll just give you my little pipe dream. What I think should happen is that the county and the Forest Service, in working through a management plan for the forest area and for Pineview, which the Forest Service does have a Pineview management plan, should put a toll booth right here, give everyone in the everyone in the valley and the canyon who lived there free passes, annual passes, and then everyone else needs to pay a user fee. And I think if you did that, you'd have a lot more people avoiding going up the canyon. The user fee could then be reinvested in recreational opportunities in the canyon. We know that Ogden City is kind of quietly buying up quite a bit of property in the canyon. One of the more recent ones that they've purchased is this property here, 71 acres. They're not being super forthright on what their plans are, but I do know that as opportunities come to buy property, they are investing, and Ogden City knows that the canyon and the Ogden Valley is part of their economic development plan. And so preserving these areas is going to be important. I wouldn't be too surprised to see Ogden City essentially preserve this as a potential community park, even an Ogden City owned and operated park. If you go up Provo Canyon, you'll see both Orem City and Provo City own parks up Provo Canyon, even though it's not in either of those jurisdictions. I would venture a guess you'd see something like that. Ogden City also is purchasing other properties all the way up the canyon. And so we might get some opportunities for recreation investment there. And then the parking situation around the reservoir, we all know is a mess. We've tried kind of a little social experiment of putting up no parking signs, and what we found, really that social experiment was to figure out in the Ogden Valley, how far away are people willing to park to get to where they're going to recreate? And what we found is they're willing to go a long way. If there's a pathway right next to the reservoir, they're willing to walk a long way with their coolers and their kayaks. And so they'll park further than the no parking signs in the next residential neighborhood they have, which causes problems for those residences, and then jump on the pathway, for example, up in these areas here, jump on the pathway until they get down to the beach. A user fee will help provide improved parking areas, help provide recreational trail areas, and access opportunities to the reservoir. That is what I think should happen. It is a little bit of a pipe dream, but I think with the right voices at the table and having that conversation, I think it's possible. You just got to get the county commissioners to move on it. And ultimately, I think it's a combination between the county, the park district, and the Forest Service to make sure something like that happens. In the absence of all of that, UDOT's plan as far as the canyon goes is to provide very, very minor and modest safety improvements, and that's it. They did a full engineering study on all of these curves and corners a few years back, including a public involvement study on what should and shouldn't happen, how to potentially get a pathway up the canyon so you get cyclists and pedestrians giving an opportunity to go up the canyon without being in the road. And the result that came back was it's going to be too expensive to do anything except for maybe repair some bridges and smooth out some of the curves in general. I was just up there, we were looking at the wayfinding signage, and I was walking this area right here with the UDOT representative and talking about the potential of maybe squeezing a pathway between the concrete barrier and the cliff edge right here. And the representative from UDOT mentioned that you get a lot of rock fall right there. That's why the concrete barrier is there. So even if you put a pathway here, you'd never keep it clear. You'd always be relying on people to be out there kicking rocks off of it. And UDOT has put a price tag on the need to put what's it called? The geofabric, the geotechnical netting all the way up to that cliffside to keep things from falling down. And it was like $4 or $5 million just for this area, which they've done all of these improvements on this side here. And they said this stretch here is far worse and far more of a priority to fix than over here. But because one rock went through one windshield and it got a lot of traction, they did this side instead of this side. So just some of the constraints that UDOT has and the cost, I just don't see a ton happening in the canyon. Other than gridlock will keep people out, it'll also keep people pretty unhappy. Sorry, long explanation. Hopefully that got to the heart of your question and then some.
No, thanks for the clarification.
But
Thanks, Charlie.
oh, yes.
I appreciate it. It's very, very good summary. It's good to be thinking ahead, even if it's 30 years off.
Okay, so unless I hear someone say this is a terrible idea, we'll consider the FR1 zone a sending area.
Chair, can I ask a question?
No, tonight we're not doing any public hearing. It's just for the commissioners.
This is Commissioner Schuman.
Oh, I see. Okay, go ahead.
Charlie, I've heard that the Forest Service is planning to build a fence all around Pineview. Have you heard that?
I haven't. Do you know what kind of fence they're planning on building?
I haven't heard about the kind of fence, just that they had gotten approved funding and we're planning to build a fence all around the entire perimeter of the lake.
I think I might know what you're talking about. Hang on a second. I'm going to make a note just to make sure I get clarification from the Forest Service so I can get back on that. Forest Service fence around. There are certain locations. I don't think it's all the way around, but if you heard different, let me know. But Anderson Cove, they've got quite a bit of money coming in that they didn't expect to have to provide improvements. And right now, the plan for the Pineview Loop pathway, the next extension, so right now, just to make sure everybody knows, with the improvements that were done on the east side of Huntsville here, the Pineview Loop pathway, it comes in here, it runs down the road. The city wants to keep it on their surface streets. They're not going to be doing any kind of side paths or anything. It comes down past their park, right down here, jogs back up down this little small street, and then comes down the old highway that used to run right into downtown Huntsville. It capitalizes on that old road that goes right past the campground that's since been abandoned by the Forest Service and right out by Chris's. Okay, that is where Pineview Loop pathway currently ends. There is funding that has been secured both by the county and by the Trails Foundation of Northern Utah to extend this all the way down to Old Snow Basin Road. So all the way down to here. However, as it passes Anderson Campground, the Forest Service has some pretty big concerns because the marina, where are we? The entrance in and out to get to the marina, I mean, in the summertime, you'll have vehicles lined down the road and pulled over into the side here trying to get in for a boat launch, right? And they limit the number of boats, or at least they're supposed to, and they say they do, They limit the number of boats that launch. And so the people who are in line, they've got to wait for a boat to come out in order for them to get in. And so you'll just have people stacked up in cars and boats waiting. You guys have probably all seen it. 4th of July weekend. So they're really concerned about building a pathway that crosses these entrances into that park. Now, I don't share their concern. I don't have the same concern they have, but you know, they are who they are, and they own most of this. Even if we build it in the right of way, there's still a special use permit from UDOT to, or from the Forest Service to UDOT. What they would rather do, and honestly, Trails Foundation would rather do the same. They'd rather build that pathway around the outside of the campground area on the shoreline, which would be fantastic. However, they've got an issue right now. In order to use any of that beach, you've got to be a payer. You've got to pay to use the beach. And so if they got a pathway where people can slip in and not pay, or people coming in from the back and getting to the campground without paying, they've got concerns about that. So the only fence that I've been told about was that if they did a pathway here, they would probably fence this whole area and only have certain entry gates where they can better staff that and be aware of who's paid and who hasn't paid. That's the only one that I'm aware of. Have you heard?
Yeah, so it's similar to what you heard. The Forest Service came out and we were building a fence along some of their property line, mentioned they received a grant to fence in all around the lake, not just that area, but close in like down Stringtown, close in all those areas that have been used, and keep the public out is what they said, other than in designated areas. And I just didn't know if you'd heard of that.
No, let me follow up with the Forest Service to find out. I mean, that's a pretty penny, but I mean, if that's how they're thinking they could do crowd control and crowd management, that may be a way to do it. Honestly, if they implemented a use fee going up Ogden Canyon, and then again, you could have a use fee at any one of these parking lots for anyone who comes up over Trappers or North Ogden Divide, I think they're going to get a lot more revenue than building a fence around and trying to navigate people towards these specific locations. But I'll reach out to the Forest Service Ranger, Sean Harwood. He and I are in contact, and we talk every once in a while and see if there's more to this than I understand. And I'll let you guys know. Any other thoughts, chastisements, words of affirmation?
I'll send mine in written form. I'll get them to you tomorrow.
One more time, Shannon?
I'll send my thoughts into you in writing.
Okay, perfect.
Hey, Charlie, just one quick comment. It's going back just a minute as we were talking about building storefronts in Eden, and the 65% of glazing requirements for those buildings. I think we need to really look at that. That's really a more urban look. If you're trying to get the old town look and you're requiring 65% of glazing on those buildings, that's really going to be tough to achieve. So just maybe something as you guys are going through, look at that requirement. It's a very urban requirement, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. As we were talking or looking at that, I didn't want to interrupt Steve, but I think was what he was trying to mention was we're only looking at the first story, not the whole building.
Okay.
And 65% may be too much. And so we'll get in there and take a good close look at the amount. As an example,
and then just one more thing while you're looking this up, the 5-foot setback for those buildings. I do a lot of building in very urban areas, and the infrastructure to try and fit all the infrastructure in that 5-foot setback is extremely difficult. So I don't know if that's something you guys have looked at as how we get the infrastructure around a 5-foot setback of a building. Power, Usually the water and sewer's out in the road, but usually the power is in that setback, and maybe your communications and stuff like that are in that setback.
It's actually the biggest concerns that our engineers had as well. So we do have a franchise agreement with most of those utility companies. When you're looking at an urban core and you've got that 5-foot setback, the utility companies have to come out into the street. They usually don't like to be in the street because front 10 feet of somebody's yard is a lot easier to tear up because you're not dealing with the street infrastructure that's there. But when the utility company installs, or when we go out and install all this, all of those utilities would need to be essentially under what would be the sidewalk. They'd build utility vaults in certain locations for access, but they would underground and conduit most of those facilities in the sidewalk. Now the sewer would be in the street, storm drain would be right there off to the side, and the water would be most likely in the street. But the other fiber, power, and gas would generally speaking be under the sidewalk.
And yeah, it's just really tight to squeeze all that in there typically if we're only 5 foot back. But just if you guys are, still working on this and just talking with utility companies to make sure they've got the room they need to do, to get their infrastructure in.
What we could do is we could do even a 10-foot setback, minimum setback for that utility company. Right now, our ordinance say that all lots have to have a 10-foot public utility easement across the front property line. We could always do a 10-foot setback, but require that area to also be usable as public space. That may be a way to solve that. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think that makes a little more sense if we could do something like that, but just shoot it around the office and see what you guys can come up with. But I think that's something to look at, just because I deal with it as far as building end of things, and I do a lot of work in Salt Lake City, and it's a disaster in Salt Lake City. They've really shot themselves in the foot on what you can do. And I know this is not ever going to be Salt Lake City, but
Cross your fingers.
there's some similar requirement, there's some similar things that are happening that maybe is going to be the same kind of issues they run into. So if you guys would just look at that and see what you think.
Okay, I love it. A lot of people tease us because we're urban planners, and they say we don't live in urbanized areas. We don't need urban planning. We need rural planning. And concepts are all there, whether or not you're looking at the big city or you're looking at the small town. And if you don't want to become a big city, the best thing to do is hire an urban planner to tell you how to not do it. But I just wanted to show you this picture here. This is a blacksmith shop. Quite a bit of glazing on the front, but you're right. When you're looking at this area here, not as much. And so what we may need to do is, I'm kind of thinking about maybe writing some exceptions into the rule. For example, one of the things that we really want to kind of focus on is the architectural motif. And if somebody can get to a style like this without doing the 65% or even 50% fenestration, and result in a building that represents the architectural style of the time, I think that would be phenomenal. So Steve and I actually just talked about this earlier today, that there'd be exceptions to the rule that basically says if an applicant volunteers to provide an architectural style that is more in keeping with the time period, that the planning commission, the county commission essentially has the discretion to waive certain requirements. I think maybe that'd be a good way to go. That way we're not getting, biggest concern that I have is just sheer wall brick sheer wall without any architectural relief or anything like that. The quickest way to kill it downtown is downtown.
Yep. Okay, thanks for addressing that.
All right. You there? Charlie?
I'm here.
Okay, there you go.
I didn't know if somebody else was looking to speak. Any other ideas or thoughts at this time? I'm more than happy to be done talking.
Charlie, John Howell.
Hey, John.
I know quite a bit about traffic, and your roundabout back of Sam's and Walmart are not pedestrian friendly, but there's not a lot of pedestrians there, as you know. A lot of people don't stop for red lights or stop signs making a right turn. Why would they yield to a yield sign in a roundabout? Salt Lake City can tell you all about that, with pedestrians and bikes getting run down, drivers making illegal right turns through red lights and stop signs. And then on the other hand, your plan for that area is to create pedestrian traffic. And here you want to put a roundabout in there. And people are people, and they're going to cross the street the shortest distance. They're not going to walk way down the street and go crossing. They're going to cross right there. And a roundabout is not good for that intersection. A signal is safer, a lot safer.
I agree with you, Commissioner Howell. I think your observation is right on point. Like I mentioned in the presentation, if you have these crosswalks set back way back here, a pedestrian's not going to use that. And that's actually one of the reasons why, John, as you look at this, it's why when you're looking at the roundabout area, we didn't focus on pedestrian-oriented commercial here. We actually focused on the pedestrian-oriented commercial over here where the four-way intersections can occur instead of here. So what I see happening here is you've got majority of traffic is going to come in here, go around the roundabout and head on up to Powder Mountain or Wolf Creek. Or the majority of traffic is going to come through here, flow around the roundabout and head on out of here. The folks who want to stop and get out of the car will be turning into parking areas that lead to these pedestrian corridors and, well, pedestrian and vehicle corridors, but walkable corridors, leaving this area to be a little bit more car centric. Whereas you look over here, this one is intended to be primarily pedestrian centric, no roundabouts here. So I think you're right on par with your observation, and hopefully we're planning for it.
Question, how unreasonable, or is it reasonable to expect them to do like an underground tunnel like at the mouth of Ogden Canyon?
Where specifically are you thinking?
For the underground tunnel? I'm just somewhere under that road to divert the bike and walk traffic.
Honestly, there are a lot of different opportunities, and I'd say it's very reasonable. It's expensive to do, but it's reasonable. You just get box culverts and you put them on under the area. In fact, if you had the ability to kind of, land is the issue, right? Because you gotta slope everything down. But if you have the ability to slope a sidewalk down and then have, you know, even diagonal crossings, I think you're going to get better traffic flow. If you Google pedestrian safe roundabouts, some of the images that will come up are actually images out of China. And some of their intersections, what they've done is they've just they took all the pedestrians over top, and they just built pedestrian bridges over top of all the roundabouts, and those pedestrians can go in any direction they want to go at the second level, whereas the vehicles would then go under those bridges. Now, super expensive, and there's no way we're going to afford that unless we get a few billion people living here, but there are opportunities that are far less expensive, like you mentioned, tunnels under. Just a matter of figuring out the budget and figuring out how to pay for it.
So UDOT would be open to that, I'm guessing?
Yeah, I mean, they've already done it in a few different locations. It's not just the tunnel under 39, but you've got a tunnel that goes under, it's actually Ogden City that did it, but a tunnel that goes under Monroe. There's an existing bridge that goes under Washington, but they had to retrofit it to a greater expense than I think it would be if they just built a tunnel.
Hey,
yeah.
Charlie, last time we bid a tunnel across Wolf Creek Drive, it was over 500 grand just for one little tunnel. So just know it's probably cost prohibitive, but great idea, but it's really expensive.
Yeah, and there's a couple of locations, if they could do a tunnel, I'd love to see a tunnel here. I mean, I'm really grateful they put the push buttons in for pedestrian crossing here. I don't know if you guys have seen that, but you go push the button and the lights flash now as if you're downtown Ogden. They forgot to paint the crosswalk, which I did mention to the UDOT rep where I was walking around town with today, that they forgot to paint it. So hopefully you find a paint there. But this area here where the speed limit is 55 miles an hour, that's, I mean, you definitely need to be looking at undergrounding that in these kind of locations. But when you get to a village area, I mean, you're really constrained and your price tag goes up. But I mean, it's not impossible if you plan ahead. Great thoughts, great observations. Any others?
Charlie, what are the downsides to the TR doing the property development right switch? See, I mean, it seems like a fairly good idea up front. What are some of the downsides?
So the downsides are that, let's say it's a mandate. You know, you can't develop on your land. You have to sell. The idea behind that would be, number one, let's just make sure we're talking about apples and apples. The county commission at any point in time has a full authority to rezone everybody to one dwelling unit per 20 acres, or even one dwelling unit per 100 acres. A lot of people think that that would constitute a taking. It doesn't constitute a taking. They wouldn't have to pay anyone to do it. If there was the legislative discretion to do that, or excuse me, legislative backbone to do that, they could do it. Now, they're not going to, because they're very pro property rights. And so is it possible on the flip side that they say, well, you can't develop it unless it's 1 unit to 20 acres, but you can get paid to not develop the rest of them, even though we're not going to let you to develop them. So there's a little bit of a give and take there on exactly how strict they want to get. If they do get that strict, there's that downside is someone who might have been banking on the idea of developing their land as their retirement, maybe they're not going to get quite as much money, because I don't think you're going to be seeing a development transfer go for the same price as selling a 3-acre parcel. You're just not going to see, you're not going to see developers who want to build in this area paying that kind of money. So that's one downside. Another downside is if you don't do TDRs, what's the outcome? The outcome is 1 dwelling unit every 3 acres. Some people are just fine with that. I've spoken with a number of people who said, that's fine, 1 dwelling unit every 3 acres, that's enough elbow room for everyone. A lot of downsides and a lot of constraints to doing 1 unit every 3 acres, the primary one being that then you have no open space anywhere, unless you're including somebody's backyard as that. And you get weeds everywhere because it's too big to farm, too small to mow. But everybody gets their 1 unit per 3 acre development right. So if you implement the TDR program and you mandate certain sales, there's a downside as well. The biggest downside, if there is no mandate to send and it's only incentive based, it's based on whether or not we can get a market going and get willing sellers and willing buyers. The downside is that we've got to track all of that. We have to know who sent what where. Right now, I could track what everything is because the green areas say 1 unit every 3 acres, the red areas say commercial development, and maybe in the future mixed use development. And so I know exactly how many development rights everybody has just by looking at the map. Once you start moving things around, things get complicated, but we have developed internally a mechanism to track that. And not to get in too deep into the weeds, basically, every landowner who buys will have a contract or a covenant recorded to the property saying, I have purchased a development right. Maybe it's just one. I purchased 1 development right It's being recorded to this property with this parcel number, and it's coming from that property with that parcel number. And then the seller would also record a covenant that says, I have sold the development right. It's coming from this parcel number and it's going to that parcel number. And so we'll be tracking them that way, and then we'll start mapping them as well. It's just going to be a management thing. People could have the benefit of buying a whole bunch of them, assigning them to a property. Let's say somebody can only, even after we allow the TDR, someone can still only get 10 units out of their property. Maybe it's 1 unit every half acre. So they can only build 10, but they buy 50 and they transfer them. Well, the other 40, they can just sit on until they can find a willing buyer who's willing to buy them from them at a higher market rate than they purchased them from someone else. And so it's almost like a new monetary system. It's almost like cash in the bank. So they could bank them on a property and then sell them that way. Anyway, your question was, what are the downsides? It's tracking. It's making sure somebody doesn't get more development out of the property than they otherwise could have. We can't guarantee if someone has the ability to build 10 and we decide it's 10 just based off of the raw number. Let's just say it's 30 acres in a 3-acre zone. We say, all right, that means just based off of raw numbers, you can get 30 or you can get 10 lots out of this. They sell all 10 of them, or maybe they sell, no, let's just say they sell all 10 of them, wiping out all the development potential. And later on, we find out that there was no way, because of topographic constraints or geologic constraints or something, there was no way they were ever going to get 10 units out of that property anyway. Well, those 10 units have been moved to another area, so you can't take them away anymore. So there's a potential you get a couple more units out of that than would otherwise have been allowed on the valley floor. I think that might be one of the bigger downsides.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. Anything else?
Somebody talking? Oh, Charlie. A question. In the old Eden, the roadway that we're talking about, that narrow roadway with a 10-foot lane on each side, what is the space on 25th Street where they have the angle parking, and how much driving space on each lane is there?
We did go out and we measured that, and the travel surface, the asphalt travel surface, is almost the exact same as what we're proposing here. Now they've got, so the 10-foot travel lane with the 45-degree parking next to it. That's a wide travel lane. I would love to go smaller than 10 feet, or excuse me, 10 foot, 12 foot. I would love to go smaller than a 12-foot travel lane. I cannot, under any circumstances, convince the engineers that that's a good thing to do. In their mind, a travel lane is 12 feet no matter where you are, no matter what kind of car you're driving, it's 12 feet wide. It doesn't have to be, but it is what it is. I don't think I'm going to convince them otherwise. But there is enough distance there for people with a modest sized vehicle. Maybe it's not the extended crew cab extended long bed, but a typical vehicle to pull out and still be able to see traffic coming towards them before they're in and including the travel lane. That's the width that's there.
Well, the problem is on 25th Street, it's almost impossible to back out of that thing because you cannot see anybody coming.
Yep. So you got two issues with 25th Street. They put so many overlays on there that you got to crown that the nose of your car, where the driver is sitting, is lower. And so as you're trying to see as you back out, the three-dimensional geometry you're looking at is harder to see around the vehicle that's next to you. But you're right. As you get backing out of there, you got to be out in almost in the travel lane before you could see those vehicles.
Are in the truck getting
Yep.
out.
Yep. Our engineers, we've been working with them on what those distances should be. And if you look at let's just give you a real life example so you know what to look at as an example when you're up in the area. This development here, let me turn off some of these layers here. We measured the half width from the sidewalk curb that's here. Let me zoom out, just make sure everyone's comfortable. Here's the grocery store. Here's the four-way stop. Coming down, you got those cabins surrounding a gazebo. When you drive past, if you look, the measurement from the sidewalk to the center lane here is almost the same as what we have. It's a little bit narrower. What we're proposing is just a little bit narrower. It's still enough to back a vehicle out in this area here without ever hitting the travel lane.
When this project was being approved, I had measured the church's back out area down the street. And I was opposed to this space, but they said the engineers, they said it was okay. This is 40 miles an hour through here.
Yep. Yeah, and speed is a definite factor. I've been working with the engineers. The traffic engineers will tell us that they have to post the speed limit at 85% of what the traveling public are traveling on it. They say they have to. There's room for engineering discretion there. I have looked it up, and they can have engineering discretion, but state law says where you've already posted it at a certain speed, you can't reduce the speed except in 5 mile per hour increments unless you do a speed warrant study. And so what we're going to have to do as we're looking at these Main Street areas, because you're right, 40 miles an hour is not going to work going through these areas. They need to be 30 miles an hour or less. I would suggest 25. We're going to need to do a traffic warrant, speed warrant study, and show what it is we want the future design to be. And when we go to reconstruct these streetscapes, that street warrant study is essentially, it'll come back with a different speed limit, either 25 or 30. So those speed limits will come down.
25 would be probably the best speed through there.
I agree. I know Commissioner,
Being 30.
when Commissioner Burton was looking at this, he was very concerned about it turning into a Provo City Center Street, which is 15 miles an hour. There's actually laws in place that would prohibit us currently from reducing something to 15 miles per hour. But yeah, I agree. I think if we can get it down to 25 just for the blocks that are commercial, just from here to about here or so, and then it could pick back up in speed and then reduce back down and then to about here and then pick back up again. The impact to the drivers, it's not going to be any more than seconds, maybe 60 seconds maximum when you're looking at just those segments going 25 miles an hour. The safety to the community and the pedestrians is going to go skyrocketing up. And what are you doing when you're going 25 miles an hour in a downtown area and trying not to hit pedestrians, other than looking at what's in the storefronts and looking at the signs that are there? And that's a great way for commercial storefronts to get new customers. So great thoughts, Commissioner Howell. Thank you. Any others? Okay, Mr. Chairman, I think we're ready to convene if you're ready.
I don't know. Maybe we should think about a few more things.
I can talk for another 45 if you want me to. My mouth is.
How about this? Nobody wants the stoplight. Let's just leave it with that.
Okay, put a period at the end of that sentence, so with an exclamation point.
All right, I move to adjourn. Thanks, everybody.
Charlie, you're doing a great job. I tell you.
Thanks, John. It's really a team effort. We got Steve here who's providing a tremendous amount of effort into this, probably a little bit more than I am, in fact. So really a team effort, but thank you. Have a good night.
I guess we're done.